The Education Department has a message for the states. End DEI in schools, or risk losing your federal funding. State education departments have 14 days to comply. Joining us to discuss is the host of the Educate U.S. podcast, Nick Zaveri. Nick has also worked with schools and districts across the United States, helping schools train staff and build curriculums. Nick, good to have you with us. With your background and experience in the education system, what's your response to this directive?
Yeah, it really comes down to, and it's not just this administration. We've seen previous administrations use the federal purse to push forward a vision. If you read the letter from the Department of Education to schools, the Dear Colleague letter, it states where the administration's view is. That in matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the push for that initiative feels to them as a continuance of the violation of Title VI about ensuring that students have access to an education system that, is not denied them in any way due to race. My view, though, is that, I know we'll talk more about this, but like in terms of matters of diversity, equity, inclusion, I struggle with where the administration's finding an issue with that. I mean, we're talking about President's Day, and, an example of, General Washington is, an incredible military leader, but also someone who owned slaves. So, there's an importance to balancing our understanding of history. This idea of DEI being viewed from a negative light because it sheds some form of racism. Well, racism has been sort of part of America's history. I think it's fair to look at sort of both sides of that argument, though.
For sure. There's many arguments on both sides. It's a rigorous debate that's going on out there. And of course, the Education Department is condemning what it describes as overt and covert racial discrimination in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. What's your experience of the DEI policies and their impact on schools today?
Yeah, previously to working where I now am in higher education, I worked for an organization that supported equity initiatives in schools. So in many ways, it was an organization that embraced the principles of diversity, equity, inclusion. And the work in schools was really recognizing where that need was, specifically in addressing the needs of non-white students or creating classrooms that promoted more equity. But I want to be clear here that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not necessarily from matters of race. It's interesting because the Department of Education and as a proxy really for the Trump administration, it's viewed under a racial lens. And I'm not going to sort of get into an argument here about what is that telling us? I mean, specifically in relation to Title VI, which I think is important to examine. But in my experience of it, it's the idea of creating spaces for children that everyone has access to learning. The opportunity for teachers to grow their skill set to make sure that every child has the opportunity to learn. Teachers are provided with means to recognize the different needs of students. When we think about equity, what we're talking about is recognizing the different needs of others. To present it as a form of bias, in my in my time, and I've been in education. I worked in that previous organization for 15 years. So in all the time I've been there, I've never seen any efforts to marginalize or make less than white or Asian students.
In your view, then, who will lose out in this process of eliminating DEI and who will come out stronger?
So, those who lose out are those who really struggle. Again, the deadline was 14 days. So, we're looking at 2 weeks. Those who really struggle with looking at how to build classrooms or build schools that are not necessarily, based on those principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, those who really have it built into their DNA are going to struggle. I mean, what's at stake here is federal funding. Federal funding in this case comes really down to Title I funding, which is for students who are essentially at the poverty line, receiving free or reduced lunch in schools. Title II, which of course is in reference to professional development. Title III for students who are English language learners. I mean, there's a lot of federal dollars that schools receive that, if you are not in compliance with what the Department of Education's mandate is, are going to suffer. In terms of those who may potentially gain, I'm at a loss for that, because I think really this argument from the administration about DEI is really cosmetic. And again, it's tied to the lawsuit in 2023 that obviously went to the court, where essentially, some white people and Asian people feel discriminated against. And I think we're still having the conversation of, exactly where does that feeling come from? And are you also aware of the fact that this is really a continuation of what, non-white and non-Asian people have experienced? So, um, but I think in terms of those who lose out, it's going to be those who really struggle with trying to create a space where those principles of DEI are not there. But honestly, in many ways, this is cosmetic because if you're making adjustments to curriculum, which many schools, I'm very curious to see how embedded DEI efforts are. I think this is the administration making a sweeping generalization, but schools are going to have to look at really just scrubbing any reference to these principles out. That's not to say that they necessarily will not continue to support those principles, but in matters of curriculum, what's written on your classroom walls, yeah, you're going to have to start getting ready to start redacting things like it's a CIA document.
And so while many see removing DEI policies as a step in the right direction, others, as you've mentioned, see it as a step in the wrong direction, we have seen a significant decline in reading and math scores in recent years, whether that's related or not. So what more, if anything, though, does the Education Department need to do, in your view, to improve the system overall for all children?
I love that question because I think that takes us to really at the heart of what we're talking about ultimately, which is how do all students benefit in the United States? In general, even prior to 2020, we've seen metrics that have pointed us to that as a country, we continue to struggle in matters of math and reading. We are losing out to the rest of the world. And it's embarrassing considering, when you look at our GDP and just really how wealthy a country we are, that we're continue to poorly educating our kids. Two things to consider there. One is we're talking about this based on standardized testing, which is an inherently flawed model. And when we look at other countries that are performing better, there's less of a reliance on that. So first thing I would say there is we need to rethink the way we embrace a culture of testing. I'm not saying necessarily get rid of these assessments. What I am saying is when you start to tie this to performance metrics for teachers, and again, I'm the parent of a fourth grader, and I've heard that too, of when we get to closer to the examination, we have to get our kids quote unquote ready. But that really produces a culture of test preparation, and you're moving away from really just trying to teach. And as a person who's very passionate about reading, I would also say we need to get back to thinking about reading in the form of novel studies and really deeply connecting with the work of authors. When we cheapen reading to really be excerpts of passages and from basal readers, which is anthologies of short excerpts of texts, we move away from students actually being able to read and really understand contextually what they're reading to really a focus on an examination. I also think too that with this administration and this the new, obviously with soon to be Secretary of Education McMahon, because I think she'll pass, we got to come back to nationalizing teacher licensure. There is a national teacher licensure effort that's been around, but we need to be very clear about it. In the state of Pennsylvania, it's ridiculous to me that you can have a really qualified teacher in New Jersey that has to go through all kinds of hurdles in order to be a teacher in the state of Pennsylvania. And that's vice versa to other states as well. We need to examine what does it take to keep good teachers, because part of those numbers that you just mentioned ago is also tied to the fact that you're seeing a high level of turnover. You're not seeing teachers who are committed to the profession 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And there's a variety of factors, but one of the biggest ones is we're not respecting the profession and we're not putting enough support behind it, not just necessarily in terms of dollars, because that's really a states matter issue. That's not about so much federal funding. We're not doing a good enough job of making that a desirable profession. And when students like my fourth grader are seeing that level of turnover, which not necessarily in her district, but really neighboring districts around here, it really makes it harder for kids to build that connection within schools or the school community to thrive when you're constantly dealing with a personnel change in the most valuable place of across the building, which is the classroom.
Much to think about there and work on in days and years and more to come. Thank you so much, Nick
Absolutely.
Zaveri. Great to speak with you.
Thank you.